Turning to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Responding to CIA suspicions, in September of 1962, President Kennedy warned Nikita Khrushchev not to put missiles on Cuban soil. Khrushchev responds that he's not doing that. Of course, he was lying. On October 15th, 1962, photos from a high-flying U-2 spy plane clearly show missile sites in Cuba. There were 24 launchers detected. And these sites were well underway. The Soviets had arrived in Cuba with medium-range missiles earlier that summer. These missiles were capable of 1,100 miles in launch distance. And also, by the summer of '62, there were 41,000 Soviet military personnel in Cuba. Clearly, this was no small operation, either by the Soviets or by the Castro government. President Kennedy convened an executive committee of the National Security Council. For the next 13 days, the entire duration of the missile crisis, this group would meet night and day. The executive committee quickly split into two major camps, although there were differences within these camps. And the camps, we'll call them the conciliators, led by Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the United Nations. And the other camp, we'll call them the hardliners. And they were led by Senator Fulbright of Arkansas, Dean Acheson, and Vice President Johnson. The conciliators essentially argued that existing intercontinental ballistic missiles already could do lots of damage to the U.S. Why risk war over a few new sites in Cuba? They pushed for the demilitarization of Cuba, including a U.S. pullout from its base in Guantanamo, and the pulling of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which of course was close to the Soviet Union. Stevenson and others argued that essentially that was a provocative threat to the Soviets, much as the Soviet missiles in Cuba constituted a threat to us. On the other hand, the hardliners argued either for invasion. Senator Fulbright argued for a direct land invasion of Cuba, or they argued for airstrikes on the nuclear launch sites that were being built in Cuba. And Dean Acheson and Lyndon Johnson, among others, argued for airstrikes. This was a very popular position early in the talks of the executive committee. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, John's younger brother, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and Undersecretary of State Ball, however, opposed airstrikes, arguing that it was too risky and could easily start World War III, with the Soviets likely first to hit West Berlin. And also that it was too provocative, a sneak attack, they said, like Pearl Harbor. Responding to the conciliators, John F. and Bobby Kennedy viewed their approach as too soft and as too appeasement-like. Throughout this crisis, the Kennedy brothers were very concerned with the need to appear tough and credible, particularly to the American people, but also to American allies around the world in the Cold War. On the 22nd, 7 days after the crisis began, Kennedy publicly announced a middle position the position of quarantine. Under this position, the U.S. Navy would not permit further shipment of military equipment to Cuba by the Soviet Union. Also, President Kennedy warned that the U.S. would treat any Soviet missile shot at Berlin, West Berlin, Western Europe, or the Western Hemisphere, or any part of the Western Hemisphere, as an attack upon itself, and would launch, quote, a fully retaliatory response in response to such an attack. The world went on high alert. This was the closest the world ever was to nuclear war, at least as far as we know. Millions of people living on the east coast of the U.S. Either did leave the coast, thinking that that would be the most likely place for the Soviets to attack, or packed up the station wagon so that they were ready to leave the East Coast at a moment's notice. Not that that necessarily would have done them any good. They would have had time to get out. The president summoned his wife and 2 young children back to the White House so they could all go into a secure underground bunker. Actually, on the 20th of October, Kennedy did that in case things really went to the mattresses with all this. On the 26th, Khrushchev notified the United States of his acceptance of the U.S. conditions in return for an end to the quarantine and a promise not to invade. I'm getting ahead of myself. On the 23rd, everyone breathed a big sigh of relief when the Soviet ships that were approaching Cuba either turned around or agreed to be boarded and searched when confronted by the U.S. Navy. 3 days later, on the 26th, Khrushchev notified the United States of his acceptance of the U.S. conditions in return for an end to the quarantine and a promise not to invade Cuba. However, on the 27th, Khrushchev sent another cable in which he added new conditions. Under these conditions, the U.S. would have to remove its missiles from Turkey. On that same day, tensions went even higher when a Soviet missile shot down a U.S. U-2 high-flying plane over Cuba, killing the pilot of that plane. The Joint Chiefs of Staff became irate and called for an immediate airstrike on Cuba. A majority of the executive committee supported that position. Kennedy, however, ordered the planes to wait at least one day. Robert Kennedy then suggested responding only to Khrushchev's first note. JFK did this publicly while also having Bobby talk to the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin, to tell Dobrynin that if the Soviet Union would accept the deal the next day, the U.S. would at a later date pull its missiles from Italy and Turkey. JFK had planned to pull those missiles anyway, realizing that the submarine-launched Polaris missiles had rendered these Jupiters unnecessary. Khrushchev was surely relieved at the American proposal, and he personally dictated an acceptance letter early on the morning of the 28th. While most Americans, and indeed people around the world, must have breathed a sigh of relief on the 28th, a few were unhappy. Cuban exiles felt betrayed by JFK's non-invasion pledge, and many of Kennedy's top military advisors were extremely angry that we had not invaded or otherwise attacked Cuba.